Graphs of trigonometric functions and their inverses. Here I have a sketch of f of x is equal to sine x. I can see that it is a function because it passes the vertical line test. In other words, if I took a vertical line and drew it anywhere on this graph, it would only touch the graph in one spot. Now I'm interested in what is the inverse of this function. Well, if we recall our studies from about inverses, we know that an inverse and its function are reflections over y is equal to x. We also know that the x's and the y's are interchanged, and we know that it must also be 1-to-1. Well, 1-to-1 means that it must also pass the horizontal line test. So if I took a line, a vertical line or horizontal line, and I drew it anywhere on this graph, I would see that it touches the graph in more than one spot, which means that it is not 1-to-1. So what I'll have to do is I will have to restrict my graph. So I'm going to restrict this between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So here's my restriction here, so that it will be able to pass the horizontal line test and it will be 1-to-1. I'm going to draw the restriction. Here I have y is equal to sine x, and this is my restriction. I'm going to draw my x and my y axis. Well, I know that it's going to go from a negative pi over 2, so here's a negative pi over 2, to pi over 2. I'm going to list my critical points, and my critical points would be negative pi over 2, negative 1, 0, 0, and pi over 2, 1. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put my 1 here and my negative 1 here. It's going to look like this. I can see that I've got negative pi over 2, negative 1. So I am here. I have 0, 0, and I have pi over 2, 1. So we can see, like I said, it's going to look like this sketch. So there's my function with my restriction. Now I'm going to go ahead and sketch the inverse. Y, or f of x, is equal to inverse sine of x, or arcsine x. I'm going to draw my x and my y axis, and remember that we said that the x's and the y's would interchange. So I now have a negative 1, negative pi over 2, I have 0, 0, and I have 1 pi over 2. Also, my axis will change. Instead of negative pi over 2 being on my x-axis, it's going to be on my y-axis. So here's a negative pi over 2. Here is pi over 2. Here is a negative 1. And here is 1. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to graph this. I have negative 1, negative pi over 2. I have 0, 0. And I have 1 pi over 2. So here's my inverse here. Now let's look at where it's restricted. Where it's restricted, the domain is going to go from a negative 1 to 1, or that interval, and my range is going to go from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Now let's look at f of x is equal to cosine x. What is its inverse? I can see that it does not pass the horizontal line test, therefore it's not 1-to-1. The domain will have to be restricted, and it's going to be restricted from 0 to pi. So I'm going to draw an x and a y axis. I'm going to draw the restriction here. And it's going to go from 1 to negative 1, and it's going to go from 0 to pi. So I'm going to push this up, and I'm going to look at my critical values. I would have 0, 1 for my original graph. I would have pi over 2, 0, and I would have pi, negative 1. So we'll sketch that. All right, I have 0, 1. I have pi over 2, 0. And I have pi, -1. So it's going to look like this, just like this piece here. Now let's sketch f of x is equal to inverse cosine of x. I'm going to draw my x and y axis. Of course, we know that instead of this being pi, pi is going to be here. Pi over 2. And then I'm going to have -1 on my x-axis and 1 here. We're going to interchange our x and y. So I have 1, 0. I have 0 pi over 2. I have -1 pi. And they're really, I want to put them in order from left to right. So I'm going to put this one first, this one second, and this one third. So I have -1 pi, 0 pi over 2, and 1, 0. So we're going to plot that. Okay, -1 up to pi. Then I have 0 up to pi over 2. And then I have 1, 0. So it's going to graph something like this. Now let's look and see what are our restrictions on our domain and range. So the domain, it's going to go from a -1 to 1. And for my range, it's going to go from 0 to pi. Now let's look at our last graph. F of x is equal to tan x. What is our inverse? Well, we can look to see that if we do a horizontal line test, that this function is not 1-to-1. So we're going to have to restrict the domain. We're going to restrict the domain. We can see that we have asymptotes here in blue at -3/2 pi, pi over 2, pi over 2, and 3/2 pi. We're going to restrict it between this right here, between the asymptotes. And so we're going to set up our x and y axis. And we know that our x's and y's will change, and so will our asymptotes where they are. So I'm going to put my asymptote here. This is pi over 2. And right here, and this is a -pi over 2. And in between, and this is going to be at 0, my graph is here. So my domain is -∞ to infinity, and my range is from -pi over 2 to pi over 2.